All right, we're going to begin our intro to evolution. Okay, here we go. So evolution, bum, 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 is the change over time, a long time, a lot of time, in the characteristics of a population. Okay, and we'll talk later about how individual beings can't evolve, but populations can evolve, and do evolve. And a population is all the individuals of the same species that are in a particular area. Now, modern biology is based on our understanding that life has evolved, that evolution has occurred. But of course, this is not how it always was. In the beginning, early biological thought did not include the concept of evolution, right? So, of course, it was very heavily influenced by the church, theological ideas, who maintained that all organisms were created simultaneously by God and that each life form was permanent, fixed, and did not change. Okay. Now, scientists, being a curious bunch, kind of started looking around and seeing a lot of stuff. And by the early 1700s, there'd been a lot of travel, exploring new lands, and by the 1700s, there were accumulated by the naturalists a very, very large number of a large amount of evidence that showed many, 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 many different species. Okay. The number of species that existed was far greater than expected. And it's actually still believed that we're kind of just scratching the surface, that there are way more species that we haven't even discovered yet than actually already exist. Okay. So then this, kind of curiosity about all of these different species and how can they all be, collected together with some thoughts from our naturalists and geography. We'll get to geography in a minute, but basically, the naturalists said that geographic areas all had their own sets of species. Okay, some of the species in each area were closely resembled one another, but different in some characteristics, and they also resembled species in other areas, but were different. Okay, and to the naturalists and the scientists, these patterns seem inconsistent with the idea that species were fixed and unchanging. Why create two species that were very similar except for one subtle difference? Okay, and people started to speculate that life had actually evolved, that life had changed from an original form. Okay. And there are many ways and many theories out there that kind of reconcile the thought of creationism with the thought of evolution. And one was advanced a while back by this guy, Georges Louis de Clercq. He was the Comte de Buffon. And he suggested that the original creation provided a starting point with a small number of species, and then those species that were created slowly changed over time through natural processes. And this seems to me like a pretty realistic idea. Okay. So scientists, again, were continuing to look around, and people started to dig around and find fossils. Okay. And fossil discoveries kind of gave us some hardcore evidence and showed that life has changed over time. Okay, fossils are the preserved remains or traces of organisms that have died a long time ago. So petrified remains of bones, wood or shells, or impressions left in the mud. Other fossilized things such as footprints or tracks, burrows, pollen, eggs, feces. There's so much fossilized pollen, like we can't even deal with it. Okay, and here's some examples. So fossilized eggs, fossilized feces, bones are our most famous fossils, of course. Footprints or tracks, impressions of skin, all these things are considered fossils. So the distribution of fossils in rock layers. So now we've got the geologists on board. We got the naturalists. We've always had the naturalists. Now we got the geologists on board. They studied the layers of rock and the fossils embedded in them, and recognized that certain fossils were always found together in the same layers of rock. And this would suggest that they lived at the same time. Okay. And also how the fossils were organized within the rock layers corresponded with the age of the fossil, as well as were consistent with fossils in different areas of the world. Kind of the same layer of rock had the same types of fossils in it. Okay, fossil type A was always found in rock layer beneath a younger layer with fossil type B, and again, beneath an even younger layer with fossil type C, and so on. And so the fossils in the oldest layers, okay, were very different from modern organisms. And as you got closer and closer to the surface, in younger rocks or younger layers, they more closely resembled modern organisms. Okay, a lot of the fossilized species were, of course, extinct, means that they no longer living on Earth. Okay, so here's kind of a little diagram. We've got the oldest rocks on the bottom, and then medium rocks, and then the youngest rocks on the top. And the older the rocks, they contain species that were much different than our modern species. Okay, so conclusions that we started to come up with: different types of organisms have lived at different times in the past. And this, of course, countered the view that species were created at one time and did not change ever again. Again, geology provided evidence that the Earth is exceedingly old, because basically they're saying that, you know, we haven't had time to change to this degree. But this guy, Lyell, presented an idea of uniformitarianism that explained that the Earth's landscape was produced by past action of the same geological processes that are observed today. And by accepting this theory, it says that, you know, like it would take time to form mountains or erode valleys, and so that implied that the Earth is very, very, very old, which would give us time for organisms to evolve. All right. And finally, we get to our good buddy Darwin. Hooray! And another dude, Wallace, who we don't really know, but basically did the same thing as Darwin, just Darwin got the credit for it. They both provided evidence, very convincing evidence, that evolution was driven by a simple yet powerful process. We're going to call it natural selection and talk about it next. And basically saying that organisms adapt or change to best suit their environment. Okay. And of course, Darwin's finches are the famous example. Okay. Large ground finch has a big beak for crushing big seeds. Small ground finch has a little beak suited to small seeds. Slide these guys up here. We've got our warbler finch, okay, has a sharp pointy beak suited for getting insects. And then the vegetarian tree finch, it only eats leaves, and so its beak is suited to eat leaves. And you see they all have the same body structure and type, and you know, some of them have similar coloration, but because they eat different things or live in different areas, their bodies change slightly in order to accommodate that. Okay. And that was Darwin and Wallace proposed that thought. They both independently proposed this, and then they kind of got together at the Linnaean Society in 1958. And then Darwin shared his book that he was, or the big paper he was writing on the origin of species. And he had a lot more evidence, like hardcore data, than Wallace did, which is, again, why we think about Darwin when we think about evolution. Wallace kind of just knocking around stuff in his brain. He was exactly correct. He had the exact same ideas as Darwin. But because Darwin had the evidence and then he published them first, good boy Darwin, he is the one who we know, father of evolution. Thus endeth the lesson. Okay,